We want to welcome Emilio Lopez, the County Administrative Officer. And if you would please just generally give an overview of your duties, responsibilities, and departments that you oversee currently.
Absolutely. Thank you, Chair. Board of Supervisors. I wanted to bring something up here because it was kind of funny to me. I Googled while I was sitting next to County Council just now the primary function of a County Administrative Officer. And it says, oversee the preparation, adoption, and administration of the county budget. And so I thought that was kind of funny, actually. I really did. But in addition to that, I am the primary department for implementation of board policy, the policy that you all set to ensure that those policies are administered efficiently and effectively. That also applies to personnel policies, which is our memorandum of understanding with our represented groups, our resolutions with our unrepresented groups. We are the purchasing agent office, so we're purchasing officer for all things purchasing in the county as far as overseeing that, anywhere from services and supplies, capital projects, contracts, fixed assets, etc. And as I stated just now, we are the budget officer for the county, recognized budget officer under the Government Accounting Act. My office also oversees the Office of Emergency Services. I am the Director of Emergency Services for the county. We oversee the Recreation Department. So by default, I am the Recreation Director as well. Currently, we oversee Human Resources and Risk Management as well. So I am the HR Director also. And that being said, I want to kind of mirror what Auditor Controller Mr. Shad said. Our staffing, even though our vacancy rates have been pretty high over the past several years, our turnover has been unmanageable at times. The staff that have kind of lived through this and worked through this are absolutely phenomenal. We have an amazing staff that keeps us afloat, that keeps providing services to this county and to this community. And honestly could not say enough. I could spend my entire allotted hour talking about the staff that we have in our departments and countywide actually providing the services. So I definitely want to say that before I get too far into this. In addition to those, we have other branches, like I just said. We oversee the Human Resources Risk Management. We also do all contract negotiations, are involved in most contract negotiations for the county. The lead negotiator for contract negotiations with our represented groups. So we don't only oversee those policies, we actually negotiate those contracts as well. We have, I think, 21 full-time positions in our divisions. We currently have 5 vacancies. And also, kind of by default, the board has recently branched off human resources and risk management, but currently I am still the human resource risk management director, and that is still a division of administration until an HR risk management director is hired. So moving forward with part of the strategic plan is to separate those divisions. A county of our size, I think we're probably one of the only ones left in California where risk management and human resources is still under the county administrative office, and so just a huge step forward for our county and actually developing that as a separate department, and we're pretty excited about that. So I think currently we have 9 applications for that position, so we're excited about that, and hopefully we can get somebody to actually understand where Del Norte County is and come join us up here and run that department. Other than that, I'm available for answering questions through the budget units that I administer. And actually, Clint and I administer a lot of these budgets together as a budget team. The 100 budget's one of those, contingency budget's one of those, 611 budget is one of those. But today I'm handling the 111, the 112, 184, 531, 711, 216, and 220. And those budget units are Board of Supervisors, Administration, Veteran Services, Recreation, Court-related services, and the Public Defender.
Let's start at the top with the 121, or 112, sorry.
How about 111?
111, okay, go.
Go in order?
You go,
Okay.
111. I'll flop it. Go ahead.
So that's the Board of Supervisors budget, correct?
Correct.
That's correct, yes.
So our salaries and wages stay really consistent because we just are not subject to any increases. If we were to get a salary increase, it has to come by resolution to the board, and it has to be voted on publicly. Is that how that works?
I believe it's ordinance. Is that correct, County Council? To change any Board of Supervisors?
Yes, it's written into our local ordinance what you guys' pay is.
Okay. I'm not complaining, I'm just asking. But one thing I do want to talk about.
Well, honestly, to touch on that really quickly, the Board of Supervisors has not had an increase in a long time. So it's long overdue, in my opinion. Just to
Well,
put that out
I'll
there.
just tell you, if you work 40 hours a week, it's $18 an hour. You know, and we get paid for 30 hours a week, so it's 20 something an hour. So it's a very low paying gig. I don't think any of us are in it to make any kind of money, but it certainly would be something, if we think about the future and a strategic plan, is to have a salary that will attract somebody that is going to come in and make a career, even though there's term limits, but to make a career out of it. So I'm sorry, Dean, did you have something?
No.
I would agree 100% with Supervisor Starkey on that. I mean, this job is very limited to the people that could run for this position because they can't afford to do it otherwise unless they have another career to back them up, or they're independently wealthy or retired with some other kind of income stream coming in. In order to make this equitable and for folks to have a quality person to vote for, somebody other than me, you're going to have to pay them. Bottom line.
I mean, there's 4 of us still sitting here too that are quality.
Retired.
Well, if I could
And
piggyback off
both
that.
of us have jobs, right? Other than this, but the bottom line is, if you're going to get some people in here to run for these positions, you're going to have to bump the wage, which I've been advocating for.
Yeah, and if I can
10
piggyback
plus
off that a
years.
little bit, it's similar to the discussion I just had with you about splitting the Human Resources and Risk Management Department from admin. There are current structures that have been in place for a long time that we've outgrown. I think Auditor Controller Shad hit on that as well with the budget and the massive growth we've seen in the budget and the requirements we have for our county government. And so when the Board of Supervisors were developed as part-time positions, I honestly think that we've outgrown that. That's just my opinion.
You've outgrown that. In the last 20 years, you've outgrown that.
And just to give you guys some context, the last ordinance that went through for Board of Supervisors salaries was in 2007.
I was just happy you didn't say you'll never get anybody competent not paying these better, without paying better salaries. So
Other than Chris. So, I mean, this is probably a little bit of a touchy subject, but I'm just so curious, and I looked it up this morning. It's $7 million, I believe, for the health fair, or the health fund, the benefits. Does every department get charged even if there's vacancies? Or, like, for instance, when I divided this up by 6, which is us and the clerk of the board, I know I don't take benefits, but it was still the same amount. So even if we don't take the benefits, you still charge that.
Yes, the allocation has been in place for years, is not a direct charge by any specific mechanism in a department. So what we do is use FTEs. So the approved full-time equivalent positions, that's how a department is charged, whether they're filled or not. And I think it currently is $14,000 per FTE. Our actual renewal for our health plan, I think, was $8.4 million this next year.
Oh, it was. So it's going to even go up.
and that's why if you the cost difference and savings if you freeze a position as opposed to eliminate a position, because even if you freeze a position, you're still paying for a lot of these other FTE costs.
Is there any way to adjust that? I mean, because I'm assuming that number is based on, let's say, 500 full-time employees, and we are typically running 385 full-time employees. Is there any way to adjust that?
You can, but it doesn't change your premium, so the amount per employee would just go higher.
Okay.
You're still paying the same amount for the health insurance. And we've talked about different allocation methods based on the tier of insurance you're using by department. It just gets more complicated administratively because then as you do your open enrollment and things like that, new employees come on, employees leave, you're changing that continuously. This is just an easier mechanism based on the FTEs the board's approved.
And are we limited based on one insurance packet here? Because I'll say Sonoma County, we could have Kaiser, Sutter, whatever.
Currently, yes.
Okay.
We've looked at alternatives, but honestly, to be completely honest, it's been an administrative undertaking for the Human Resources Office, and we haven't have the capacity to do so. One of the options that have come up have been a higher deductible plan. Right now, we're at a current 80-20 plan. Having a 60-40 plan may be something that some of our employees would be interested in, but it's one of the options we've looked into. We are looking at some alternatives, and hopefully with Human Resources Risk Management Director, if that is actually something we can hire and get that department in place, we'll look at things that we've kind of discussed over the past couple of years with our insurance broker and maybe implement some of those changes.
Okay, thank you. For the Board of Supervisors, travel and training, it seems like we've been steady with the allotment at $35,000. Everything is increased. Everything costs more. It's just one observation that perhaps we need to increase that amount in the projected budget going forward. It's just an observation.
Yeah, and 100% at the discretion of the board, and I don't disagree with you. We could easily increase that a little bit if the board would like us to do that.
Okay. And then my last one for the Board of Supervisors is that the net has increased 48% since the actuals of 21-22 and 34% since the actuals of 22-23. Given that the payroll hasn't increased, what aside from the liability insurance, this pretty much significant increase in liability insurance, would explain kind of that overall net increase? Are those all just calculated numbers, or do you go through and say, we need to increase this service and supplies? Like, is there a percentage? I guess my question is, for the various things, our overall net has increased.
There's not any certain formula for some of these things. Typically, you look at the history of the accounts and then anything that you know going forward, if there's rate changes for utilities or something like that, for example. So things that I noticed in the Board of Supervisors budget that have increased, one of them is a cost plan, which is pretty significant. I think it's in the $60,000 range. So that's another item on top of your liability insurance that's increased significantly, which would be a huge swing for that overall percentage. In addition, one of our advocates, I think it was our federal advocate, it may have been our state, that increased their monthly amount just recently. I think it was last year. For the first time in a long time, though, and give them a lot of credit. They worked at the same rate for a long time.
Is that great?
And so that's a $12,000 increase per year. So those are some of the items that are.
And speaking of liability insurance, what is it that spiked it so high in this particular budget? I mean,
Well, for the board, it's primarily going to be claims driven because, as Supervisor Starkey just mentioned, you don't change a lot from an exposure standpoint. Our insurance is based on exposure and claims, and so it's your overall percentage of the county claims. We had a couple of pretty high claims for the Board of Supervisors the last couple of years, and so when you have something like that,
that's where it rests.
yes.
Gotcha.
Yep.
Thank you.
And it's something that was just actually charged to the Board of Supervisors because it was an overall county claim. It wasn't like you guys did anything wrong.
Any other question for board budget? Please, let's move to 112. Any questions about the administration budget?
I don't have any questions. I just did note that splitting off from HR to admin, or splitting HR off from admin, did decrease a lot of your expenses or your salaries and benefits. But I think that just is natural, right? We had to go and develop this whole new department. And so things that were itemized under, services and supplies, you went line by line to say, okay, this needs to now move over to HR. Is that correct? Okay.
Yes, that's correct. Turn my microphone off. And that's actually still in the reconciliation phase. We just wanted to make sure with the board's approval of the HR director and the separate department that we had a department for the recommended budget in June. So you will have something that's more reconciled for the final budget.
I just had one question about the professional services line. Why the jump from the department request of $300,000 to under the workshops lines, 428, just kind of curious why the big jump.
for the past several years, and this kind of ties a little bit into the conversation you guys were having about the fund balance and budgeting your available resources. We've tried to focus on professional services for the past several years because of all the things that we feel administratively may have not been addressed over the past several years. And so a lot of that ties into professional services and consultants. And as you guys recall, we did the on-call services that we have agreements with several consultants for engineering, timber professionals, architects, things like that. So we have a number of people that are on call for those types of services. And with the approval of the strategic plan, a lot of that requires professional services. And so we budgeted the last few years at $300,000. And if you recall, just recently at the last board meeting, we approved a contract for a comp analysis, which was $128,000. And that's what was the addition to the $300,000.
Thank you. Didn't connect that to professional.
The only question I have was on your CalPERS request was 91.8 and workshop shows 179.99. Where is the difference in that? Under your retirement CalPERS salaries and benefits?
That's a really good question. I asked my auditor controller that this morning.
And his answer was?
What was the question? I wasn't paying attention.
It's the UAL.
And the answer is?
I was just thinking a minute ago we talked about cutting budgets, and these
Wake up.
professional services would be cutting stuff like that. We wouldn't be hiring them. What was the question?
It's the UAL split between the two departments.
We got to fix that.
Okay, that's just fix me, right?
Yeah,
Okay.
no, that's so when
It was a test. Good catch.
yeah when we first did the split, we kind of did an automatic, like everything kind of got shotgun blasted everywhere. We went through line by line on the admin, budget, service, supplies, and we haven't gone through one quite yet. The UAL is going to be changed.
Okay. And then the other, under employee benefits, directly below that, 1,030, looked like previously it was 153, 177, and then right down to 60. Is that because of moving HR out?
Yes, that's correct. Those are now split between the two budget units.
All right. What do you want to tackle next?
Any questions about 184? That's the new HR risk management budget. Like I said, still kind of in construction mode.
Anything
I
about
don't-
HR?
I don't. I'm excited to hear we have 9 applicants. That's all I have to say.
Then we'll move on.
I really appreciate the advertising expenditure on the glossies brochures that were used to recruit for that position. I think that was definitely an effective tool.
Well, the new recruitment method also utilizing that service. You know, if it produces something that's viable for us, that's excellent, especially when we're looking at hiring at that administrative level. Let's go to a public defender.
Correct. 216.
Any questions for the public defender budget?
My only question, and it probably needs to be corrected in the final thing, is that why did we pay an actual year to date and benefits for the public defender when we didn't actually have a public defender?
Is that 23, 24?
I'm going off, and I'm sorry, I'm going off the old thing that Clint provided us at the June budget.
Say mine doesn't show any actual to date, so it must have
Okay,
been,
so that was
must
probably
have
already
been corrected.
I do have a similar question. It's line 10030. There's no money in any line for employees, but we do have $14,000 in employee benefits. It kind of doesn't make sense.
Yeah, that's kind of exactly what Supervisor or Chair Wilson mentioned earlier, is that it's based on FTE. Currently, we have 2 FTEs that are approved for the public defender budget, which is the county public defender and the legal clerk. We had tried to recruit for a county public defender 3 different times. The board has since changed direction to try to improve our contracted services again before we decide what we do going forward with those positions. But they are still allocated positions. I'm assuming it's supposed to be $28,000 because it's $14,000 per employee. But through the final budget, that's something that can be discussed as far as how the board wants to move forward with that.
Yeah, because the budget's not finalized, we do not have to keep those positions if we don't want to. I mean, we're going off of old policy and last year's push by the state for us to have this type of staffing. Obviously, our recruitment was blah. It went
It didn't go anywhere.
And so we could have this conversation when the board wants to, but for me, carrying this on the books is kind of silly, just my opinion.
But it does
I
sound to
agree.
me that we're going to pay it regardless. It's coming out of somebody's
It would
budget,
shift to a different line item.
maybe
Right.
DHHS.
You could only dream.
So just, a couple just justifications. The actual cost on average for the contracted public defenders has been about $500,000. We are budgeting for $800,000. Do we anticipate bringing on another public defender, or is that just the natural increases?
Yes, we're actually anticipating trying to bring on a fifth public defender. We currently contract with 4, and just based on a number of factors when it comes to caseload, if you look at state averages and also the OSPD report that was prepared for the Board of Supervisors. So essentially what we did is that we've absorbed some of those costs that the board approved for staffing that we were unable to actually hire for and move that down into the contracted services. We're hoping to improve upon the current structure we have based on some of the findings in the OSPD report.
And then I noticed that for investigators here, we've always budgeted for about 40,000, but we've exceeded that. 23,000 one year, 15,000 the next. We are not in short supply of violent crimes and very serious crimes. Although there's the mechanism in place to be able to transfer it from another line to here. Should we just budget for that extra amount, just anticipating that they're going to need that, or is there a reason why we don't?
We absolutely could. When we were talking about that this year and developing this budget, because we had increased the contracted services so much, we just knew that we had the cushion there if we needed it in the investigative line. But you're right, over the actual last couple of years, we've been more in the $60,000 range or a little bit higher than that. And we do have a lot of felonies locally, unfortunately. So yeah, it wouldn't be a bad idea at all to increase that a little bit.
Okay, and then I don't understand it, and I know there's an explanation, but we seem to be paying out of this budget $400,000 to Pelican Bay State Prison. And now we're reimbursed that same amount under revenues. Why is that recorded this way? Why do we appear to pay them and then get money back?
In order to pay them, it's an expenditure, and so we have to have an expenditure account. That's your balanced budget. So if you think about it from the perspective of a program that's funded through DHSS or something like that, looks like a grant. If you're awarded $500,000, you also show $500,000 of expenditures because those are the allowable expenditures under that grant. So this is the allowable expenditure under the Pelican Bay agreement and contract, which is Penal Code 4750. And so we, based on contracts we have with our public defenders and any other services related to those defense attorneys, that we also budget the offsetting revenue. So it's an offset.
Okay, thank you.
And
That's
I'll
all
chime in real quick on that one too. You said you showed Supervisor CEO Lopez said it perfect. We show that expense separate from our regular public defender line because it's reimbursable. So that's why you're going to see a specific line that says Pelican Bay on it, as opposed to maybe just a higher number of cost with an offsetting revenue. So like he hit it pretty well, but that's why you're going to see a specific line for Pelican Bay on both of them. It's a tracking process.
I have a procedural question. We're spending a lot of time in these meetings yesterday and today. Supervisor Starkey brings up an issue. You say, essentially, yeah, we need to take a look at it, agree to it. I mean, how is that being tracked to bring back to the board for that type of decision budget?
I'm just taking notes. It was similar to the conversation we had about economic development. And honestly, I made a note to get kind of a general consensus from the board today that if the direction from this board is for us to increase that a little bit, if the county is actually looking at doing anything in-house, internally from an economic development standpoint, Supervisor Howard is absolutely right. $70,000 is not near enough to be effective. If the board directed us to double that going into next year or $150,000 going into next year, we do that based on available resources. And currently it sounds as if we do have the fund balance that we could actually put something like that into the budget for this next year. So it would be wise probably to do that now and bring that back to you through the final budget process.
So that's all we need to do is just have some consensus today.
A motion?
Do we need a motion?
No, I don't think so. Just a direction from the budget team, because you'll see that then in the final adopted budget documents. And when you approve it, that's when it will be approved.
Then I would agree with Supervisor Howard with regard to that one line item.
And I also made a note to increase investigative services to $70,000.
It just seems to make sense.
And the board travel a little bit as well.
Yes.
I'm taking my notes.
I know we had discussions, so just for your notes, we had discussions about the fact that we have expended, I think, 20,000 or 30,000 out of the Measure R funds that we allocated for cleanup homeless, and looking at reestablishing that $50,000 threshold to carry forward into next year. So it would be a reallocation or allocating an additional 30,000 into that cleanup fund that we had established last year. So I know that's one of the considerations that we'd like to see going forward.
Where would that come out of?
Well, it could come out of our end of year revenues, moving dollars into that.
I just wondered if that could be part of the IRF fund. Could it be that, or is it comes?
I'm not sure what the IRF money would allow.
Okay.
Did you say Measure R though?
They were originally Measure R funds that we had utilized for that cleanup fund, and whether or not we want to move back into utilizing that, or whether we want to just allocate it out of our contingency or reserve.
So it's the public nuisance budget you're talking about, correct?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. Once it's established as a Measure R, something the board's willing to fund with Measure R, it'd be good to be consistent with that. Also, I kind of spoke to Director Kunstl as well. She had talked to Senior Code Enforcement Officer Mello, and they had talked about not having any kind of set project or set amount in mind. And typically when you budget something like that, I think in the past we had kind of a South Bend area and certain areas that we're kind of focused on for that $50,000. There is some funding available for that. If we can go through the process, the board has discretion over Measure R funding, and I can go back to the committee at any time. So to develop some projects and some actual costs to those projects and then bring that back to the board may be a good direction to have.
Well, I know we were holding off on Union until we get the gates in the actual get that area actually sealed off. But then that was the plan, was to move and clean out that area from what it currently exists, as well as what we're looking at as far as establishing new criteria under a new ordinance. So.
And for me personally, I think there's a lot of opportunity, whether or not CDD has capacity within code enforcement to pursue grant funds for that. But our little bit of funding we have in there, whether it's Measure R or another line item, we could definitely use as leverage with the Coastal Conservancy, because that's going to be a hell of a large cleanup back there.
It's going to be.
It's going to be huge, and I know that there is discussions also talking about the end of Waldo too, whether, is that going to be the priority now, or is the end of Union? So we just wanted to make sure that those dollars either rolled over or continued year after year.
Yeah,
until we get that cleaned up.
Yeah, and a lot of our concern making sure that we had that all walled off, it was the fact that we don't want to go like we have done in the past, go in there, expend a lot of money, and then just return it back to the homeless to go back in and allow them to
Definitely wanna be
re-inhabit
able
those
to
areas.
Make sure it doesn't happen again.
And that actually was part of the conversation I had with Director Kunstl, is that until we identify an area we can keep clean, in order to actually go in and clean it up may not be a great idea until we have a plan in place. And a lot of that's part of that's the acquisition of some of the properties that are around the properties that the county current has.
And anecdotally, I just, in as we've been talking about economic development, Humboldt's economic development program that they put into place, they started out with 3. General fund draw for those 3 individuals is 5%, and the rest of it is all. And now they're not at 3; they're actually at 10. They have 10 employees all working underneath that program for economic development. Has been so successful. And again, general fund draw is only 5%. The rest of it is all funded through those grants that they have brought into Humboldt County. So, yeah. Let's move on to Department 220, that's court-related services. Any questions from the board as related to the court-related services budget?
I'm going to pass. I don't have any good questions.
Do you have any bad ones?
I didn't have any questions after looking at it either.
Okay. Then let's move on to veteran services. That's Department 531.
So I don't necessarily have questions as much as I would love to be able to see a way to increase revenues in there so that we can start working on, and this might be building maintenance and not, but to do a little bit of improvements within that building. I know they have that upstairs room that's unfinished right now that they really would like to make into a living room or, a space, another space for them to be able to gather. Do you have ideas in which we could maybe go after? I know we had tried for that one grant funding, but is there ways in which we can increase the revenue in this budget so that we could offset some of the costs that would go into creating that space for them?
There really isn't too many ways to increase the budget in this budget unit. There are three funding sources for veteran services. It's subvention funding. It's the Medi-Cal avoidance funding that when you actually direct someone who is on Medi-Cal services to benefits through the Veteran Services Office, we receive funding for that as well. And then there's the other part of funding that's like a veteran services fund, and a lot of that's based on the number of people you actually provide services to, the number of people that you do cost avoidance for Medi-Cal. So that is kind of driven by the number of people you serve, but it really doesn't fluctuate enough to actually fund a capital improvement project. And so that would be just a board direction, kind of similar to what building maintenance is currently doing at the jail. They're actually improving some of those pods down there with our internal funding, and so it would be capital improvement funding. And the board does have some capital improvement funding that you've designated for those types of projects.
I think that would require kind of a larger discussion, having all the projects put before us before we could make that call. But it leads me to a question that's a little unrelated, but I know in years past we had considered a grant writer, and I know we've moved away from that idea. But is there something on the horizon to be able to go after funding that might work for certain projects like that? Is there a person or a position that we could have for that?
Yeah, the actual county grant writer was reclassed into the administrative services coordinator, which is currently filled. But there's a transition going on right now from the clerk of the board to the administrative services coordinator, and so a lot of the time is spent training and trying to do that transition in our department. That position is still going to be kind of dedicated towards grant-related tasks. We continue to look at the CSAC grant initiative. We continue to stay in contact with them. We have given them kind of our priorities, and the Veteran Service Office is one of them. And so it's just a matter of making a decision by this board going forward at what level we get into the grants initiative, because they are tiers, and the tiers are based on, do you want one grant assistance? Do you want assistance with 3 grant opportunities? Do you want assistance with 4? And so we've kind of pushed back a little bit and asked them to more look at available resources at the county, because the whole idea about this initiative was trying to help rural counties who didn't have the capacity or the resources to go after grants. And so in our minds, some of the tiers are a little bit outside of what our budget would typically be, and so we're hoping that they look more at resources available at local governments and kind of base their tiers on that. Of course, that's something that's going to have to change from a policy on their side of things, and how they actually fund that agreement with the Ferguson Group, which is the group that's actually administering the program. So yes, we are still actively looking at these things, and that position will still be actively involved in that.
I would suggest, and this was brought up earlier, this is where the flexibility in the contingency fund could be very useful for us. If the board, through conversation at the beginning of fiscal year, strategically places our priorities on projects, and towards, as we get through half our fiscal year or 3/4 of our fiscal year, if we're doing financially well and we're hitting our targets, which we see monthly as Clint puts these expenditures in our boxes every month, we should be fairly confident that we could go forward with some of those prioritized strategic opportunities with that strategic fund budget. And we've done that in the past, and I don't see why we couldn't do that in the future. But we'd want a list and a prioritized list in place to know what we'd want to tackle first, which is the larger part of the conversation. But that's where contingency could be very helpful to that, as long as, at the 3/4 of the way in, we've got the money. So I'd rely on Clint to tell me that.
Let's move on to your the last one we have. It is Parks and Recreation. Yes? No? Yes?
Well, no, I just want to make a comment that I see that the MHSA monies have increased for Parks and Recreation. And given the fact that we are on limited time with MHSA, if there's an opportunity for us to increase that further to purchase some fixed assets, something that's going to allow us to continue operating. I don't know if the MHSA monies can only be expended on salaries and services or if it could be fixed assets. I would love for us to be able to have some of those conversations, whether it be stocking up on, sports equipment or uniforms or whatever it is that's going to help the community with that. I know that this is, to me, recreation for our youth is one of the most important services that we provide, and you've done a very remarkable job, making sure that those opportunities are out there for our youth. So I do really appreciate that. I'm just hoping that we could get, and if we have the ability right now to earmark, for lack of a better word, some of that funding that perhaps might go away in order to get some supplies and services that we can have ready.
Is that a question or just?
You're supposed to say, oh my gosh, that's a great idea.
Well, honestly, I don't know the specifics about that funding source. I do know they pay for programs that are youth related, like our teen basketball programs and our youth basketball programs and some of our tiny tots. It's basically to fund an alternative for other activities, and so it's healthy activities through recreation. I know that in the past they have funded some of our like scoreboards and stuff like that for some of our youth programs, and so there could be some money there that's available for things like that. But I know also the state changes what's allowable quite often, and so I'd have to talk to their fiscal manager at Health and Human Services to determine what's allowable.
Any other questions from the board? Open it up for public comment.
PJ again. I figured if I was going to come, I was going to talk. A couple questions for you on Board of Supervisors. Under professional services, I see $5,000, and I wondered what that was for. That's 20234.
That is the county's estimated share of the tri-agency dissolution for
The what?
professional service. The county's share of the tri-agency dissolution for professional services, the attorney.
Ah, okay. That makes sense, I guess. Okay, administration. Some of these things I'm not going to bother with. Advertising and publications, which is 20240. I'm in administration, and you have 2,500, I'm sorry, budgeted. The actual for this year is 117, and 22 and 23 come in less than an average of $1,000. I just wondered why 2,500. And what is special department expense for administration?
Special department expense is kind of similar in every department. Under the government accounting, there's certain criteria of expenditures that you have to basically say this is services and supplies, this is other charges. And so the special department expense is usually something that's determined by the auditor controller not to fit in any of the other categories as far as office supplies, communications, uniforms,
It's not a party for the
utilities.
staff.
No, it's not a party for the staff. Absolutely not.
Okay, well, I figured it wasn't, but I just needed to ask that. And Measure R increased from, prior years there was nothing. This year, year-to-date is 15,000, and you've budgeted, this is revenue, I'm sorry, 91,075. You've budgeted almost 106,000. I just wondered where that was going.
The Measure R funding for administration is the position we just spoke about, the grant-related position. It was previously the grant writer, and we were unsuccessful in recruiting for that position, which is why it's zero for those several years. And then this year, we just filled that position with someone, so it probably shows just one quarter. I have to actually look at the detail.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's exactly what it is. If you look at last year, we just, towards the end of the year, we just rolled over with our new clerk of the board, which let our old clerk of the board go in the new position. So the costs associated with that new position were transferred to offset reimbursement. And what you're seeing in the admin budget is the estimated full year total loaded cost of that position.
Thank you very much.
Would you mind if I ask some general questions of you?
Not at all.
Okay. And because we heard from Mr. Schnatt about the reserve. And so you've been here a long time. You've had the history here. It's my understanding that with a healthy reserve, you are positioning yourself to be able to borrow money in the event that you need to, sort of thing. Is there a reason, in your historic knowledge, right? Is there a reason why we haven't established a reserve more than 300,000?
No, just basically board policy. I mean, it's simply, that's what it comes down to. Early on in my career, and I actually up until just the last 4 or 5 years, when staffing shortages started to really kick in, and then we received some one-time funding from the federal government for COVID and things like that, we didn't have any money for reserves. And so it really wasn't an option each budget year. The 4.3 million deficit you're seeing now was kind of similar to what Supervisor Short's talking about, is if you take that picture of that budget only and you're not thinking about your anticipated fund balance, it's like, how do we cut $4.3 million? That's what I was used to for the first many years of my career. And it really came down to staffing and across the board cuts to service and supplies of 10%. And you can only have $5,000 for travel and training, no fixed assets, hiring freezes. So developing a reserve is really just a board policy. In times when you have more resources, developing a reserve is not a bad idea. It just depends on what level you want to get to. And like you said, do you do it for an estimated month's charges or a month's cost of the general fund, or do you do it at a certain percentage? The one thing I would caution the board about is when we talk about reserves, we also talk about another topic we talked about earlier on with Auditor Controller Shad, is our unfunded liabilities. We're talking about building reserves, and we have some unfunded liabilities that are out there hanging over us. Recently, through a policy, the board adopted the pension policy. So one of the things to consider is when you have excess revenue is, do you build in a percentage into payroll to fund some of that unfunded liability? So you're paying down debt that's being kind of racked up at a certain percentage. So there's a lot of different options you can do with funds that are available. Capital projects, you prioritized Pike Field, we prioritized the jail, which we know is going to be millions of dollars. So those types of things that are kind of out there that the board has kind of put their finger on as being priorities through the strategic plan, all things to consider when you have excess funding.
Okay. No, thank you. That's a great explanation. It feels as if we kind of want a savings account, right? But it sounds as if there's other priorities that might need to take precedent over that.
Well,
Yeah.
and one of the tools that we've used was the fact that we did have income, or especially from the Miller Redwood sales, and we utilized those funds that are set aside that are earning interest. But what we had done in the past was we had done it for the sheriff's office, when we had done it for IT, where we utilized that money for loans, where they would pay interest back into it, but could pay for larger projects like we did with the installation of our communication system. We did it for cars for the sheriff's office. So, I mean, those are ways that we can fund projects ongoing, utilizing the funds we do have in our investments, but being able to parade it out over years, paying it back through these various departments that can utilize the money and go for the purchases directly.
And just for a little bit of historical background, the $100,000 was actually requested by Supervisor Hemmingson several years ago, and he wanted that built into the budget annually, which is why in the contingency budget right now you see that $100,000 going to the reserve again. That can be changed by this board. That policy could be changed. That could be, $250,000 maybe the goal annually. We put that into that budget. If we don't have the resources, then that's something that's kind of a low-hanging fruit for reducing costs.
Or we could always set it as a percentage of our cost plan savings, like the state does, basically, for rainy day fund kind of things.
But, and getting back to this, and I'm glad you brought it up again, and the board, in my belief, made a very strategic decision on the unfunded liability piece. That's debt that continues to grow. And we need to find a mechanism, as we did here this year, to pay that down. We cannot continue to carry those fund balances that high. And for me, prioritizing reserve over that unfunded liability, I would rather see it go to that unfunded liability, which is why I thought the board made the decision we did unanimously. But that's just my personal preference, of course. We could have that debate again.
Yes. Any other questions? And we've already done the public comment, so I want to thank you for the, oh, you're going to, Brandon, you have thought of something in the meantime, okay?
Good presentation by everybody. And you guys are definitely hardworking. A lot of respect for everyone in the room. But what is evident from the budget is the board's appetite to expand government. I mean, everything has just got huge price tags. And, you know, our budget's of nearly $250 million now. And what are we doing with it? You know, just the Board of Supervisors expenditures from 21 to 23, it went from 796,000 to 1.18 million. It's a 50% increase in a few years. The admin expenditures, $121,000 in 21-22, $368,000 in 24-25, a 200% increase. You know, payroll for admin, it was up 35%. And then I think you explained, Supervisor Starkey, that some admin positions were getting moved. So that payroll went from 914 down to $706,000. So I was hoping if you could just explain that human risk management should be human resources, right? What tangible outcome does human risk management have? They're spending $750,000. And then finally, just Pikes Field, Parks and Rec. That number just illustrates how we're underserving our youth in the community. Pikes Field is pretty much obsolete. You know, the parking isn't adequate, doesn't have ADA compliance, a lot of problems. We need a new facility. So that $500,000, the grant, we need a new facility. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, CEO Lopez, and we will
Thank you, Neil, for all that you do.
welcome Alan Winograd, building maintenance.